I walked in on my son's fiancée with my business partner of 30 years, 2 nights before their rehearsal dinner. I had my hand on the door to swing it open and say something I couldn't take back. Then my son's voice came from right behind me, low and steady, like he'd been standing there a while. "Dad, don't. I already know. And it's not even the worst part. I am 64 years old. I spent 4 decades building Callaway Meat and Provisions, a regional food distribution company out of Knoxville, Tennessee, that supplies restaurants, hotel chains, and grocery co-ops across the Southeast. My late wife, Connie, God rest her, worked beside me for the first 22 of those years, doing the books on a folding card table in our garage before we could afford a real office. We never took a vacation until our 15th anniversary. We drove a used Chevy until the wheels practically fell off. Everything we had, we built from nothing. Connie passed 4 years ago from a stroke that came out of nowhere on a Tuesday morning. She was 57. I never fully got over it, and I don't think I was supposed to. My son, Roy, is 38. He's sharp the way his mother was sharp, quiet and precise, never showing more than he intends to. He'd worked his way up in the company honestly, starting in the loading docks when he was 19, moving into logistics, then operations. When he told me 2 years ago he was ready to take the helm, I believed him. I was ready to let go. I planned to transfer controlling interest in the company to him after his wedding, per the terms of a succession agreement my attorney had drawn up. The idea was to protect the transition, keep the company in the family, give Roy legitimate standing with the banks and our suppliers. It was something Connie and I had talked about for years. Then Roy introduced me to his fiancée, Petra. She came in like weather, polished, clever, always saying the right thing at the right time. She had an MBA from Vanderbilt and worked in commercial real estate financing. She knew the vocabulary of business, which meant she knew exactly how to talk to me. She asked thoughtful questions about our distribution contracts. She complimented the framed photo of Connie on my desk without being told who it was. She seemed in every visible way like someone worth trusting. I liked her. That's the part that still burns. The rehearsal dinner was set for Friday. On Wednesday evening, I drove out to our secondary warehouse on the edge of Maryville to drop off some signed invoices, something I used to do all the time but hadn't in months. The facility manager had already gone home. I let myself in through the back the way I always had. The loading bay was dark, but the small conference room at the end of the hall had its light on. I heard voices. I thought it was the night crew running late. It wasn't the night crew. It was Petra. And sitting across from her, with his jacket off and a bottle of Boulette bourbon between them, was my business partner. A man I'll call my partner because that's the only name he deserves now. A man I'd known since we were both in our 30s, who had a 30% stake in Callaway Provisions, who had stood at Connie's funeral and wept genuine tears, and told me he would never leave me to run this company alone. They weren't just talking. The conversation I walked in on was not a casual drink between 2 people who just met. There was an ease between them, a shorthand, the kind that takes months to build. She was pointing at something on his laptop screen. He had his hand over hers on the table. I put my hand on the door. A grip closed around my elbow from behind, firm, certain. "Dad, walk with me." I turned around. Roy was standing in the hallway, wearing a canvas jacket, a set of keys in his other hand. His face was completely calm, not the calm of someone who doesn't feel things, the calm of someone who has already felt everything and come out the other side. I followed him. We walked out to the loading bay and into the cold November air. Neither of us spoke until we were standing by my truck. "How long have you known?" I asked. 7 weeks, he said. 7 weeks. I'd had dinner with that man 4 times in 7 weeks. Roy had found out by accident, the way most betrayals are discovered. Not through some dramatic revelation, but through a small administrative error. He'd been reviewing Petra's calendar to coordinate their honeymoon travel, and noticed a recurring meeting labeled simply CRP Consulting that appeared every other Tuesday for 18 months. He'd asked her about it. She said it was a real estate client. Something didn't sit right. Roy had his mother's instincts. He hired an investigator. The investigator found out that CRP Consulting was a shell company registered in Delaware. The company had one listed officer, my business partner. Roy opened the rear door of his truck and pulled out a manila folder. In the dark of the parking lot, he handed it to me one page at a time, the way you deliver bad news to someone with a heart condition. The investigator's report was thorough. The relationship between Petra and my partner had started before Roy had even met her. She had been introduced to Roy at an industry event, an event my partner had arranged invitations to for both of them, independently, without telling either one. He had engineered the introduction. He had selected her specifically because she was smart enough to be convincing and motivated enough to play a long game. He had promised her a cut. The plan was clean, the way plans made by patient people are always clean. Roy would marry Petra. After the wedding, the succession agreement would transfer controlling interest in Callaway Provisions to Roy. As Roy's wife, Petra would have legal standing to act on his behalf in financial matters under a power of attorney document she had already drafted and was planning to present to Roy during the honeymoon as a just-in-case formality. Once she had that document, she and my partner would move to restructure the company's primary distribution contracts, redirecting them through a new logistics firm they had quietly incorporated in Georgia 6 months earlier. They would siphon the revenue, liquidate the accounts receivable, and leave the shell of Callaway Provisions holding nothing but overhead and debt. They were going to steal 40 years of my life's work, and they were going to use my son to do it. I stood in that parking lot for a long time without saying anything. The cold came up through my shoes. I could hear highway noise in the distance. "I want to call the police right now," I said. "I know," Roy said. "But if we do it tonight, what do we actually have?" I didn't answer. "An affair," he said. "A suspicious LLC. Some circumstantial meetings. Dad, he's got a 30% stake. His attorney will argue he was consulting with a potential outside investor on a legitimate business matter. Petra walks away. He walks away. And the succession agreement gets tied up in litigation for years while the company bleeds." I looked at him. "So what do we do?" He closed the folder and tucked it under his arm. "We let them think they won, and then we make sure they lose everything." We drove separately to his apartment, a third-floor walk-up in the old city neighborhood that he'd had since before Petra. His roommate had moved out the previous spring, and the place had the sparse, deliberate feel of someone who preferred not to accumulate things they might have to explain. He made coffee on a gas stove. We sat at a kitchen table that had been his mother's. I knew the table. I had helped carry it up those stairs. Roy had already been working with an attorney, not our usual company counsel, but a woman named Harriet, a litigator who specialized in business fraud out of an office in Chattanooga. He had contacted her 5 weeks earlier. She was the one who suggested the plan. He laid it out for me on a legal pad in his mother's handwriting, which is to say, neat and organized with nothing wasted. The succession agreement, as currently written, transferred controlling interest to Roy outright upon execution, but there was a codicil Harriet had identified, a standard indemnification clause that my original attorney had included, which stated that any transfer of interest was contingent on the receiving party having no undisclosed material conflicts of interest. Petra, as Roy's fiancée and future spouse, would be considered a related party under Tennessee corporate law. Her relationship with my business partner, the other major stakeholder in the company, was exactly the kind of undisclosed material conflict the clause was designed to catch. If we could document that relationship clearly, the entire succession transfer could be challenged retroactively. More than that, her prior arrangement with my partner constituted conspiracy to commit commercial fraud. But Harriet needed more. She needed them to take a step. She needed an overt act. That's why Roy hadn't stopped it yet. That's why he was still getting married on Saturday. I set down my coffee cup. I looked at my son. "You've been going home to that woman every night for 7 weeks knowing what she was." He looked at the table. Yes. How? He didn't answer right away. Then he said, because she underestimated me the same way she underestimated you, and I needed her to keep doing that. I didn't sleep that night. I drove home to the house Connie and I had bought in 1987. The same house I'd lived in ever since. And I sat in the kitchen with the lights off until about 4 in the morning. Then I called Harriet. She answered on the second ring. For the next 4 days, I played the role I was apparently already playing. The sentimental old man, softened by grief, eager to hand things off, just grateful his son had found someone capable. I shook my partner's hand at the rehearsal dinner and told him how much it meant to me that he'd be there Saturday. I watched him smile. I noticed how quickly he looked away. Petra was gracious at the rehearsal dinner. She touched my arm twice when I spoke about Connie. She told me I had built something remarkable and that she intended to honor it. I thanked her. I held her gaze a beat longer than necessary, just to see if anything flickered behind her eyes. Nothing did. She was better at this than I'd given her credit for. My partner gave a toast. He talked about loyalty and longevity. He talked about what it meant to build something with your hands and your word. He raised his glass toward me and said, "To the man who taught me what it means to do business with integrity." The room applauded. I nodded. I lifted my glass. I thought about Connie. The morning of the wedding, I went by Harriet's office at 7 a.m. She had the documents ready. She walked me through each page, flagging the critical sections. The agreement they would be signing looked, on its surface, like the succession document they'd been expecting. The same weight of paper, the same formal language, the same structure. But Harriet had made 2 modifications. The first was a representations and warranties clause buried in Section 9, subsection C. It required the receiving party, Roy, and by acknowledgement, Petra, as related party, to certify that no undisclosed conflicts of interest existed among any of the parties to the transaction. To sign was to lie. To lie was to void the transfer and trigger the fraud provisions. The second modification was an interparty liability clause attached as Exhibit D. My business partner would be signing as a witness and co-approving stakeholder, which he had done on every major company document for 20 years and would not think twice about. Exhibit D contained a cross-indemnification provision, standard-looking language about shared liability in the event of any fraudulent misrepresentation by any party to the agreement. By signing it, he was personally co-signing responsibility for any fraud committed in connection with the transaction. Neither of them would read it. Harriet had counted on that. In her experience, people who believe they are stealing don't read the fine print of what they're stealing. The wedding was held at a venue outside of town, a restored farmhouse with a stone barn and a view of the Smoky Mountains going blue in the distance. It was a beautiful day, cold and clear, the kind of November sky that looks like it was painted. About 120 people. Connie's sister was there, and she squeezed my hand when she saw me, and said Connie would have been so proud of Roy. I thanked her, and looked away before she could see my face. I walked Roy to the altar. He stood straight. He was wearing the tie Connie had picked out for him years ago for a different occasion. He'd kept it, apparently, and saved it for this. When I stepped back and took my seat, he looked at me once, briefly. I gave him the smallest nod. The ceremony was short. When the officiant said the vows, Roy said them clearly and without hesitation. Petra said them with her eyes on Roy, warm and attentive. She looked like a woman in love. I had to give her that. After the reception, as we had arranged in advance with the venue coordinator, the small business signing ceremony was scheduled in the farmhouse's main sitting room, a tradition we had framed for the guests as a sentimental family ritual. The formal handover from father to son, my partner thought it was a nice touch. He'd suggested something similar himself months before when we were first drafting the succession timeline. Harriet was waiting in the sitting room when we arrived, along with a notary and 2 company witnesses. The room was quiet, separate from the noise of the reception. A fire was going in the fireplace. Roy and Petra came in still in their wedding clothes. Petra holding her bouquet, laughing lightly about something from the reception. My partner came in behind them. He looked relaxed, comfortable. He had a glass of champagne in his hand. Harriet laid the documents on the table without ceremony. 3 copies, tapped for signature. She explained the structure in efficient, professional language, the way she always did, complete, accurate, and entirely designed to make impatient people stop listening after the first 30 seconds. My partner set down his glass. He flipped to the back of his copy and signed. He didn't read a word. Petra reviewed the first 2 pages, asked one clarifying question about the effective date, received a truthful answer, and signed. Roy signed last. He looked at me as he put pen to paper. I kept my face still. Harriet collected the documents. She handed the executed copies to the notary. Everything was stamped, witnessed, and dated. "Congratulations," she said. My partner picked up his champagne again and raised it. "To the next generation of Callaway Provisions." He drank. Roy thanked him. Petra put her arm around Roy's waist and smiled at me like she'd just won something she'd worked very hard for. She had. She just didn't know yet what it was. "Before everyone heads back to the reception," I said, "there's something I'd like to say." I moved to stand near the fireplace. I've been doing this for 40 years. I've made a lot of mistakes. I've also made some good decisions. I looked at my partner. 30 years ago, I brought on a man I trusted to help me build this company. I gave him access to everything, our accounts, our contracts, our client relationships. I paused. I'd like him to know I remember that. My partner smiled. He lifted his glass slightly toward me. I'd also like him to know, I said, that I remember every part of it. The smile didn't move right away. Then something behind his eyes shifted, just slightly, the way a light changes when a cloud passes in front of the sun. I turned to Harriet. "Show them Exhibit D." She opened her briefcase. She laid a single page on the table, a copy of Exhibit D with the key paragraph highlighted in yellow. It took my partner about 10 seconds to read it. I watched the color leave his face in a way that reminded me of watching water drain out of a bathtub. "What is this?" he said. It wasn't quite a question. "It's the document you just signed," Harriet said evenly. I turned to the television mounted above the fireplace, something the venue used for slideshows at receptions. I had replaced the slideshow with something else. I pressed play on the remote. The audio came through the room speakers. It was a conversation recorded 11 days earlier in the conference room of CRP Consulting's registered address in Knoxville, a space my partner kept under a different LLC name, where he and Petra had met twice in the past month. The investigator had obtained it legally, through a method Harriet had cleared with a former FBI colleague. The conversation was 47 minutes long. I played 3 minutes of it. In those 3 minutes, my partner used my name 7 times. He described, in his own words and without apparent concern, the structure of the fraud they intended to commit. He referenced Petra's role. He referenced the timeline. At one point, he laughed and said that by the time I figured out what had happened, the company would be 3 asset transfers away from anything I could touch. The room was very quiet. Petra had stopped holding Roy's arm somewhere in the first minute. By the end of the 3 minutes, she was standing apart from him, her bouquet hanging at her side like she'd forgotten it was there. "There's more," I said. I turned off the screen. "But I think that's sufficient for the people we've been waiting for." The door to the sitting room opened. A Knoxville Police Department detective walked in, along with 2 officers and a Tennessee Bureau of Investigation agent who had been working on the commercial fraud complaint Harriet had filed 2 weeks earlier. Behind them came the investigator, who handed a USB drive to the TBI agent without a word. My partner put his champagne glass down on the table very carefully, the way people do when their hands are shaking and they don't want anyone to see. Petra didn't move. She looked at Roy. Roy looked back at her. His face was the same as it had been all day. Composed, certain, already past this. "Roy," she said. Her voice was different now. The warmth was gone. What was underneath was something harder and colder, and honestly, it was more honest. Roy, listen to me. Whatever he's told you. I know what he's told me, Roy said. I also know what you told him. I was in the room. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she looked at me. You should have stayed out of this, she said. I don't think she meant it as a threat. I think it was just the only thing she had left to say. You came to my house, I said. You sat at my table. You said my wife's name to my face and used it like currency. I took a breath. You are never getting this company. Not one truck. Not one contract. Not one contract. The detectives moved toward my partner first, reciting the charges, which included conspiracy to commit commercial fraud, unlawful use of a shell entity, and breach of fiduciary duty. The last one specifically because of his stakeholder status in the company. Petra was placed under arrest on the conspiracy charge. My partner didn't argue. He didn't perform. He just looked at me once, and I looked back. And there was nothing between us after that except 30 years that had turned out to mean something different than I'd thought. They were escorted out through the side entrance of the farmhouse. Outside, 2 unmarked vehicles were parked at the end of the gravel drive, past the string lights and the caterers and the gates who had no idea what had just happened inside. Harriet closed her briefcase. The notary gathered his materials and left quietly. The fire burned on in the fireplace. Roy and I stood in the sitting room without speaking for a while. He had loosened his tie. He was looking at the table where the documents had been. She was good, he finally said. She was, I said. He nodded slowly. Mom would have seen through her in a week. 5 days, I said. Maybe 4. He almost smiled. It was the first time all day he'd looked anything close to 20 years old. We walked back out to the reception, the 2 of us, and the guests saw us come in and someone started clapping because they assumed it was over, in the way they'd been told it would be over. A handshake, a signature, a passing of the torch. I accepted a glass of sweet tea from a passing server. Roy accepted a glass of water. We stood at the edge of the floor and watched Connie's sister dancing with her husband near the band. And I thought about the table Roy had kept. The one that used to sit in our kitchen on Maplewood Drive, and how he'd carried it up 3 flights of stairs by himself rather than ask for help, the same way his mother used to do things. I'm 64 years old. I've made my share of mistakes. I trusted the wrong person for the better part of 3 decades and didn't see it coming until my son was the one standing in a dark hallway telling me to put my hand down. But I'll tell you what I know tonight, sitting in this house that Connie and I bought together when we had more hope than money, the people who try to take what you built, by pretending to love what you love, they always make the same mistake. They think patience looks like weakness. They think silence looks like ignorance. They think a man who grieves is a man who's already gone. They're wrong. Callaway Provisions is still standing. Roy runs it now. Legitimately, with a new succession agreement and a restructured partnership with a distributor out of Bristol, who shakes your hand and means it. My partner's 30% stake was voided under the fraud provisions, bought out at base value and redistributed. The litigation is ongoing, but Harriet says it is not close. And Roy is doing fine. Better than fine, though he wouldn't say so. He moved back into the house on Maplewood for a few months, which neither of us announced or made a thing of. He just showed up one evening with 2 bags and the look of someone who needed to be somewhere familiar for a while. We ate dinner at that table every night for 3 months. We talked about the company, about logistics, about a new refrigerated route we were opening up through western North Carolina. We talked about Connie. Some evenings we didn't talk about anything at all. Those were the best ones. I think about Roy standing in that dark hallway a lot. Not the drama of it, not the outcome, just the image of him standing there, keys in hand, completely composed, having lived with the knowledge of what Petra was. For 7 weeks without breaking. I don't know how he did it. I'm not sure I could have at his age. I'm not sure I could do it now. What I know is this. The people who tried to take what Connie and I built didn't fail because the law caught up with them, or because we were smarter than they were on any given day. They failed because they made a set of choices over a long period of time, and those choices had weight. Every decision has weight. The decision to deceive someone who trusts you. The decision to use a person's grief as a lever. The decision to smile across a dinner table while planning to hollow out everything that table represents. That weight doesn't disappear. It accumulates, and eventually it lands somewhere. My partner shook my hand at Connie's funeral. I've thought about that more than I probably should. I don't think it was fake, exactly. I think people are capable of holding genuine feeling in one hand and genuine betrayal in the other at the same time. And that might be the most unsettling thing I've learned from all of this. It means you can't always read a person by what they feel. You have to watch what they choose, over and over, in small moments when they think no one is paying attention. That's where character actually lives. Roy watched. That's what saved us. He didn't react when his instincts first sounded the alarm. He didn't confront Petra the night he found the calendar entries. He sat with what he knew, got quiet, and started thinking instead of reacting. There's a version of this story where he blows it up in week 1 and they walk away clean. He understood that. He was 20 years old in his thinking in a lot of ways, but in that particular way, he was older than me. His mother would have done the same thing, and she would have done it faster. What I want to say to anyone who's sitting with something like this, a betrayal that's too big to react to immediately, a situation that requires you to absorb the pain before you can address it, is that the discipline of not reacting is not weakness. It is the hardest and most necessary thing. Rage is easy. Silence costs something. Roy paid that cost for 7 weeks, and it bought us everything. I also want to say that building something doesn't make you immune to losing it. 40 years, and I still almost didn't see it coming. Grief had softened me in ways I didn't fully account for. When you're lonely, when you're tired, when you miss someone the way I missed Connie, you want to believe people are what they present themselves as. That's not stupidity. That's being human, but it does mean you have to stay honest with yourself about your own blind spots, especially the ones that come from love. Callaway Provisions is still standing. Roy runs it. That's the bottom line. I'm 64 years old, and I'm still learning what it means to pay attention.